Hello. The Divine Code reading for August 11th, pages 129 and 130. We're now beginning part 2 of the book, The Prohibition of Idolatry. The first page is a table of contents for the book. We have an introduction by Rabbi J. Emanuel Choquette. There are 12 chapters to this part. Chapter number 1 is the prohibition of idol worship. Chapter number 2 is the prohibition of turning to idol worship. Chapter number 3, which actions make one liable for idol worship. 4, the service of Moloch. 5, forbidden statues, images, and pillars. 6, the prohibition of creating a new religion. 7, the obligation to eliminate idol worship and the prohibition of benefiting from it. 8, aspects of idolatry from which benefit is allowed and nullification of idols. 9, object offered to idols and decorations of idols. 10, the prohibition against aiding idol worshippers. 11, practices that are forbidden as customs of idol worshippers. In chapter 12, the prohibition of swearing or vowing in the name of an idol. So this follows this book is it's a halakhic book. The Divine Code is a book of halakha. It's a book of halakha for the non-Jew. And the first part of the book that we spent a month and a half on, the introduction, was more of it was an overall. It was the fundamentals of the faith. It was an overall view dealing with a lot of the philosophical issues involved in the non-Jew. Now and through the rest of the book, the focus will be on halakha. That's this legal, more of a legalese genre of rabbinic writings. The introduction. And the introduction will be today's reading and also into tomorrow's reading. So it's the first part of the introduction. Prohibition of Idolatry, Introduction by Rabbi J. Emanuel Choquette, Rabbi of Congregation Beit Yosef, Toronto, Canada. The concept of idolatry would appear to be an anachronism in our day and age, with no practical relevance in most countries. It recalls primitive societies of times long gone when paganism was rampant. For rational humans to worship artificial images fashioned by their own hands is so self-evidently absurd that one wonders how this could have ever developed. So he's asking a question: how is it that we're even bothering with this? I mean, idolatry is not something that we normally think of as being part of regular everyday life. Therefore, why have why have an entire unit going, this over 100 pages dedicated to these laws, if they don't seem relevant to our lives today? That's the question he's asking. In reality, however, it is not so simple. For one thing, even nowadays, one can find remnants of such practices. Secondly, idolatry is not limited to man-made images, but may alternatively invoke natural bodies such as celestial constellations, stars and planets, even animals and vegetation, or even fellow humans who are believed to be endowed with divinity. People, even in ancient times, developed sophisticated rationale to justify these practices. So the answer is it's not just a statue that people are bowing down to, although it does include statues that people are bowing down to. It goes out into a much broader sense. It's anything that a person ascribes divinity. That would be anything that people ascribe the power to provide, the power to create, the divine power would be the power of divine providence that can be given to a person, and that's covers a broad area that people ascribe that kind of divinity to. So that's what we're looking at with idolatry and why it's relevant even today. Maimonides presented an anthropological analysis of how idolatry evolved. See Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, Hilkot Avodah Zarah, Chapter 1. And this is quoted at length below in Chapter 1, topics 4 through 6. So there's a analysis of this that the Rambam Maimonides gave that's going to be covered in Chapter 1 on the laws of idolatry, the prohibition against idolatry. So it'll be discussed in full. Here it's discussed in brief in the introduction. Initially, there was no denial of the reality and supremacy of the one God and Supreme Being, who created everything. Then, people assumed that the submission of God to God obligated them to honor these natural forces, those natural forces such as the sun, the moon, and the stars, through which God benefits the world, and which minister before him. So they understood in those days that God was sort of on the throne, and he had his ministers that were the natural forces of the world were doing these things. And therefore, the rational, and this is where it became difficult, is that people rationalize that they should honor God, and that would include honoring these natural forces that are part of the system that God is in charge of. Gradually, this deteriorated in perceiving these forces as powers authorized to act independently of God. And the world's dependence on them would imply a rationale to worship them on their own, even while still recognizing the supremacy of God. So people were recognizing the supremacy of God, but they started to see the powers, the natural powers, as being able to function on their own. So instead of being a king who was surrounded by his ministers, it became ministers that were separate, that eventually recognized God, but they were independently doing their own thing. And these people were being honored, and therefore these independent powers should be honored, and therefore, as they were seen more independently of God, they were started to became objects of worship themselves. The whole or partial worship of these forces eventually degenerated into a substitute worship of images that represent or symbolize them. This eventually led to the images themselves on their own becoming objects of worship. So the step-by-step process, the next step is that they started using images, because you can't really properly honor or worship a natural power. Therefore, they would bring an image that was representative of the natural power. But then as it devolved even more so into the next step after that is they started seeing the images as the objects of worship. So you had some natural power, you had a storm. But the storm is there sometimes, it's not there sometimes. So how do you properly honor the storm? So you create an image and say, we're going to honor this image. And then as they forgot about the connections, they started to honor and worship the image itself, which is how people wound up having statues, and they would just make a statue and worship the statue, forgetting that it was connected to the storm, and forgetting the storm was subordinate completely to God. And they just wound up worshiping some statue that, it just became more and more detached from reality at that point. But that's where that's how the step-by-step process worked. Nowadays, this appears to be a vestige of ignorance and naivety. Thus, it seems strange that the eternal Torah should be so concerned about idolatry, to the point that it found it necessary to mandate so many cautions and prohibitions about the practices with all their corollaries, and about anything even that savored of idolatry. So anything that would even, why would the Torah spend so much time? If idolatry is just talking about some statue, I mean, it's silly, but why make it such a cardinal? Why make it such a central element in the Torah? Why spend so much time in the Torah on it? And will be continued. The answer, I guess, will be in tomorrow's Torah Daf Yami on the Divine Code. Tomorrow's reading will continue in the introduction to the prohibition of idolatry. Thank you.